All right. Welcome back to another episode of the DNA of Things, where we explore the transformative power of genomics and its impact on health, wellness, and longevity. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Koenig, and today we have a special guest. Seems every week we have a special guest, but none less special is Dr. Joe Veltman. Dr. Veltman is a renowned expert in genomics. As far as I can tell, he's been in this space for, 30, 40 years. And he's created something pretty incredible, which he has named the Genesis Matrix. Now, this is a comprehensive model integrating genetics and environmental factors for optimal health. Truly ahead of his time, this particular resource, as I mentioned, has been in the making for decades. And I just begin to think it's really at the beginning in terms of its application with all the advancements in technologies, most notably AI. And having this kind of an engine at the center is just incredibly exciting in terms of optimizing health, increasing health span. So in this episode, we delve into Dr. Veltman's journey from pioneering this functional medicine approach to developing the Genesis Matrix. So you're going to learn about the critical differences between genetics and genomics, really important distinction, and how understanding your DNA can unlock personalized health strategies, adding decades of health span to your life. We discuss the practical applications here, including DNA-based nutrition and customized health interventions, and exploring how these insights can lead to longer, healthier life. This episode is packed with actionable information that can change your approach to wellness, longevity, and health span. Let's dive in with Dr. Joe Veltman. Dr. Joe, it's great to have you. I know that we had a lengthy conversation a couple of months ago, but just the more we've been talking, the more, I see the benefit of chatting about what you do in some detail. Well, I would say in a great deal of detail as it relates to Genesis Matrix. And specifically, I've actually brought my report along, and I thought that, we can certainly dive into that in a more meaningful way. But before we do that, I wanted to, kind of go back to the Genesis Matrix, to the genesis of the Genesis Matrix, because what I'd really like to emphasize here is that, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, the difference between genetics and genomics. The DNA industry is, upon us. We're in it. It's emergent. And I think there's a lot of untapped insight that people are missing out on. And, I've been in this industry, since, call it formally since 99, since I started my undergrad and then went on to do my PhD in genetics. And I worked for a startup previously, founded a startup previously focused on human performance. And I now lead biz dev and partnerships at sequencing.com. And, I've come across a lot of reports. I've used a lot of insights for good. And I got to say, in terms of, proactive living, wellness, longevity, I feel no conflict in saying that yours is unparalleled.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah. And not just in terms of what markers you use and this notion of polygenic markers and the whole genomics aspect that we'll get into, but also how my life has gotten better because I've actioned the insights, and so that comes from the exhaustive work that you do insofar as, so it's not just a DNA report. That's really something that's really important to differentiate. It is actually from the first point of contact, when we go through the comprehensive health questionnaire, all the way to the interpretation and the actual recommendations that are given, in the form of a DNA specific, powder, if you will, that, by the way, Correct. It's not me that's been benefiting from this. I coach entrepreneurs to greatness, and it's been the saving grace as these high-powered entrepreneurs are stressed to the max. But, so I think we're going to kind of walk on the edge of performance and longevity and wellness and disease prevention, because, you say it best, like longevity is really the systematic elimination of comorbidities. But anyway, I'm kind of stealing all of your thunder here.
No, you are not. You're giving people a summary, which is great. Oh, good, good. Well, what is it they say is like, first I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say, then we're going to say it, and then we're going to tell you what we said. Because I do think that, there's not just human performance insights here, but life-saving insights. So let's just talk first about Dr. Joe, the man, the visionary, because you aren't just, a bandwagon genomicist. You've been doing this for decades. So tell me about how you got into this, and then tell me how we got to and lead me to Genesis Matrix, and then maybe
Sure.
we'll dive into some of the good stuff people can
Yeah.
expect. Okay.
So I guess I go back to the 1990s where Jeff Bland, who is the former head of the Institute for Functional Medicine, was looking for people to help with his institute in launching it to the 21st century. And I happened to be in New York at the time working with a holistic health center. I was a co-director then. And one of the things that Jeff identified about what I was doing was I was light years ahead of most functional medicine docs. And so what I was doing was using a matrix that I had come up with working with a chronic fatigue patient in Richmond, Virginia, where I was previously based. So I was chronic fatigue patients, for those that are not aware of this, they're like long COVID patients. They have multiple factors that are impacting their overall health. And so I was jotting down some things that I wanted to cover with her: genes, environment, nutrition, emotions, stress, inflammation, and spirituality. And she was a very, very intelligent woman. And she said, if you use the first letter of those 7 variables, it spells Genesis. And I said, well, thank you. That has been the basis of my working with individuals, whether they're interested in prevention or treatment or whether a combination of both. So to capture as much information within those 7 categories, I have a comprehensive health questionnaire. And out of that, and everyone has to take, if they're going to go work with me, they have to do that comprehensive health questionnaire.
So why
because
that? Why are they going to do that?
because it answers a lot of the details associated with a Genesis matrix.
Right.
It talks about genes. It talks about somebody's environment. It talks about somebody's nutrition. I asked for 5 days worth of food diary information that includes a weekend, because weekends tend to be a little bit different than during the regular workday.
Mhm.
Also, I wanted to look at their emotional health to see what's going on with relationships, their impact, their relationship with work, or however stress is impacting their life, which is the next category. And then inflammation, I wanted to see if there were some telltale signs of inflammatory like responses going on in their body. And then last was the spiritual aspects, which is really, from my perspective, it's your belief systems that you imprinted on as a kid when in your family of origin. So we're looking at all of those variables and putting the pieces of the puzzle together so that I can quickly look at that document and say, okay, where are the stress points? Where is this individual needing help? After the individual has completed that, they get the test kit, and the test kit gives me their DNA information.
Right.
And out of that information, then I overlay the comprehensive health questionnaire to then come up with a strategy for them where they may have listed some priorities in the comprehensive health questionnaire, but with the DNA information and the comprehensive health questionnaire, I may have a different priority for them.
So you talked about, this first, let's call it client zero, if you will, the chronic, was it chronic fatigue or
Chronic fatigue. No, it was chronic fatigue patient. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which in the 1990s was, quite popular, and because nobody knew how to correct it.
Right.
And nobody had treatments for it. And so this was a challenge for any clinician at that time. It still is, because it's like the Genesis matrix. There are so many things that are interwoven
Right.
into that person's presentation that it becomes difficult to unravel unless you have a model to use.
Right. So yeah, it's not as simple as, oh, well, you're stressed out, so you need to meditate, or
Right.
you need to avoid caffeine, or no. So you're talking about, well, actually, I mean, this was interesting. So when I think about, my report, and what let's do this as foreshadowing, because we're already jumping into Genesis Matrix. I want to hear more about your journey, how you got from how you got from client zero to where you are now, which is hundreds or thousands of people that you've helped. So yeah, just with respect to, one of the things that we identified in our work together was, certainly because of the nature of my work, I expect stress, and, I've worked with a lot of high performers so that I have a lot of, tools and tricks in the bag, so to speak. And so I was, definitely integrating aspects of meditation and prayer to be, much more balanced, if you will. And, but one of the things that we noticed, I think it's probably because of one of the MTHFR variants, that, well, this stress isn't necessarily psychological, it might be biological. And so, this is what led to a, custom powder. For me, I think one of the additions we made was the acetylmethionine. I'm getting actually a lot of mileage as well out of niacin, but that's a separate conversation. But so yeah, the interesting thing with chronic fatigue, like back in the 90s too, like my mom was initially, diagnosed with, say, chronic fatigue, which later turned into, MS, right? So
okay, yeah.
And I think there's a lot of, quote unquote chronic fatigue out there that, the pathologies are different, right? I think so you've got this one person, but presumably now you've developed this matrix and you've worked with other people, not just with chronic fatigue. I know you've worked with, well, we know you worked with we know you're working with, the longevity enthusiast population as well. But I know you're also working with these, I think it's pre and even post-menopausal. So talk me through how you got from client zero to, like, what are some of the other case studies that you've seen, and how did the matrix help you?
So the matrix is really tied to someone's DNA. So there are about 8 different categories that I'm using within the DNA profile map that I have currently.
Right.
And it looks at somebody's cardiovascular risk, their bone health, looking at someone's risk for emotional disturbances, how they respond to stress.
Right.
Whether they have body weight issues. And it looks at someone's, to tap into what you were describing, is someone's detoxification pathways. And one of the things that was of interest and intrigue for me was the ability of a woman, and a male for that matter, to get rid of estrogen metabolites. And because we have biomarker testing with the lab that I currently use, then we can overlay that information on top of somebody's genomics and almost come up with a predictive score as to how someone is detoxifying these estrogen molecules so that they reduce their risk for estrogen-induced cancers.
So when you say predictive score, are you talking like polygenic risk factors here? But it's because it's more than that, right? Because it's environmental as well. So it's polygenic risk factor plus all the acronym risk factor.
Right. So if they're overweight, if they're using bioidentical hormones or HRT, all of these things are factoring in to someone's risk for an estrogen-induced cancer, whether they're premenopausal, postmenopausal, perimenopausal. And so it's really looking at that individual as a unique human being, N of one, if we're using particular lifestyle choices, their dietary choices, nutritional supplements that they may be taking are impacting estrogen metabolism.
Well, it's interesting. You say it's an N of one, and I get that it is an N of one in terms of, well, say me, Jeremy Koenig, N of one. But we know that Jeremy Koenig, depending on how we slice and dice time, there's an N of, well, infinity, right?
Yes.
And so what's interesting is that, what I found just in our dialogue is, we go through the matrix, we have the reference point of DNA, which is kind of as a compass. But then, once I start to go through different stressors and challenges, it's kind of like hitting the reset button, in terms of, well, now we're on a new, diagnostic process, so to speak. So I mean, that could be something as simple as, well, transitioning through different stages of, the life cycle from, adolescent to young adult to, adult in their prime to, moving into more senior. It could be job changes. It could be, the introduction of a new baby. That's like basically a new planet in the solar system. That's something that I can attest to.
Yes.
It comes with a good amount of marketing. So they're all those, as you say, they're stressors. And, I think everybody knows that, well, there's no catch-all to dealing with life. But I think like there is something to be said for having an unbiased, and by unbiased, like basically having an expert oversee the conversation, like an unbiased conversation with somebody who's unbiased as it relates to your transitioning through different stages of the human life cycle and different stressors associated with that. And then it just kind of like reshuffles the whole, matrix where, if I'm, for example, whatever version of Jeremy I was when I was doing my PhD and competing at a high level at track and field, there's a huge like cognitive and physical demand that's going on in parallel versus Jeremy in startup land, something totally different versus Jeremy, the coach. So how has that been in terms of all the people that you've worked with, or if you can just think of, one example? I know, because I know you've worked with some of your clients for years or decades,
Yeah.
the results they get. How is DNA the gift that keeps on giving? Because I think what we run into with, current solutions on the market. So I'm not pointing fingers, but I'm saying names like 23andMe and Ancestry. A lot of people will go to them for, well, predominantly Ancestry, and well, then they get into their mind, well, your DNA doesn't change, and that's true, and so then you might think, well, it's just one and done. Once I have that information, that's it. But it's not true, because the context changed, the environment changed, and so therefore what you express, what you are an expression of, changes. So how has that evolution of just even one person, what's that been like in the context of providing them DNA-driven insights towards wellness and longevity?
I think it's a great question, because DNA becomes sort of your, as I like your analogy, it's a compass. It's a direction finder. And basically, if I'm going to use a case history, because I think it's important to understand, as someone ages, there are stressors and impacts in that person's life that's going to highlight various aspects of someone's DNA. So I'm going to work with a woman that I've been communicating with, contact with for more than 20 years. And this was shortly after I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. She came to see me because she was diagnosed with ER positive, estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. And she went through the traditional standard of care, which was basically chemo and radiation. And she had also surgery, but she didn't want a recurrence. And so part of the DNA data at the time was just to understand how estrogen may have precipitated her ER positive breast cancer. And so she had some hiccups, what I like to refer to when I'm talking to the general public, catabolism of estrogen through phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification. And so by getting that information, we were able to say, using some biomarker testing, say, okay, you've got an excess of an unwanted or undesirable estrogen receptor or estrogen metabolite called 4-hydroxyestrone. And that is a very, very toxic metabolite of estrogen as it's making its way through the body. And so we were able to provide her with a product called Dimpro, which is a unique blend of diindol methane and phosphatidylcholine. And then you're probably saying, well, why did they put phosphatidylcholine with DIM? DIM is pretty much a hydrophobic powder. And this particular company said, we're going to increase someone's bioavailability of this DIM product by linking phosphatidylcholine, which is lecithin, which is an emulsifier. So by doing so, you increase its efficacy in that individual. You don't have to take as much, and you can use the biomarker testing to come back and evaluate her on a interim basis, whether it's a year, whether it's 6 years, or whether it's 10 years. I get a call from her, and so as I said, I've been working with her for more than 20 years, and I get a call from her, and she said, "Joe, I got a problem." And I said, "What's the issue?" And she said, "I've been diagnosed with breast cancer in my other breast." And I said, "What has been going on with your life?" Because she's been on the protocol of following this recommendation based on her DNA. She's gained weight because of COVID. She's also had lots and lots of stress in her life. Her husband was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He has COPD. He had to move from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Phoenix, Arizona. And if you've ever moved in your life, you know that that is a horrendous stress, especially for someone who's older aged. Because you have to develop new friends, you have to find an environment that's consistent with who you are. And so all of those things contributed to her, again, lack of processing the estrogen metabolite. Because even though she's postmenopausal, she's producing estrogen because of the fat cells that she has basically harbored for more than 5 years. And so even though estrogen levels from her adrenal gland and her ovaries are lower, the fat fertile state as a woman. The problem was that she didn't check in with me periodically to say, here are some changes going on in my life. One, I'm under a lot of stress, and two, I've gained a lot of weight. So had I known that, I would have said, okay, we need to do another biomarker test to see what your estrogen levels are. And we can do that through a salivary test looking at the free levels of estradiol, progesterone, and testosterone. And why am I looking at testosterone? Because testosterone gets broken down into estradiol. So from all of that information, we were able now to give her some things after she had her chemo and her radiation to keep her free from those estrogen receptor-like cancers. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. As you know, I did my undergrad in biochemistry and molecular biology, and I did my PhD in genetics. And so you and I are speaking,
Yeah, I know.
language. But I mean, and this is the point is, like, to anybody who's listening, they, to be fair, they speak their own language, whatever their own profession is, right?
Mhm.
So, and that's, I think, what we're getting into is, the value of, outsourcing this. I don't want to say outsourcing the authority of your genome. That's not what it is. But I mean, it's kind of like if you're going to climb Mount Everest, like, you get a Sherpa, right?
Of course, you get a
And
guide.
you need a guide. And I think the thing that, that I'm seeing is that, and I'm saying genomics because it's not single marker DNA insights. It's genomics. It's not even just genomics. It's genesis. It's the matrix. It's the environment. Right? So what I found, what I find is, well, it depends who you talk to, right? So
Mhm.
if I'm working with an athlete who, let's say wants to, win the 100-meter freestyle swimming, let's say,
Sure.
or sprinting, doesn't matter. They're dealing with hundredths of a second that they want to shave off, and they're super dialed into, essentially anything that can help them get to that end. And so, I'd go so far as to say, like, they are in the pursuit of getting a PhD in their own body, right? And
Yeah.
and they have great advisors around them, so they tend to have. Well, they'll have a coach. They'll have various therapists, for, soft tissue injury
Sure.
avoidance. They probably have an orthopedics guy on call. They've
Yeah.
got, nutritionists. They've got a whole, gamut of individuals who are there by design to help them understand their body. And so, when I talk to, the super ambitious athlete, they get it, or they're a quick study. They work a lot with supplementation, and they're highly in tune with their biochemistry, and they're looping in their circadian rhythms, etc. And so, okay, that's a very motivated individual, because guess what? At the end of the day, it's literally their body is the vehicle to their success.
Correct.
Other people who they're not stressing their bodies in that way, or relying on their bodies to say, for their livelihood. You mean you can get away with, letting some things slide. The interesting thing that I observed when we did these research studies on athletes, where we would monitor things like your rate of perceived exertion. So like just a simple question, like how hard was the workout? And then you marry that with other questions. But there are three main questions. How hard did you perceive the workout to be? How well did you sleep? And then, like, were you doing the right thing? Right. And so that's like, were you doing the critical, important thing? And so that became a great decision tree, if you will, to lead to very sophisticated conversation around, well, you're missing this particular micronutrient, say, for example, liver and B12, while you were training at altitude to try to jack up your red blood cells, and genetically you don't convert those nutrients well, or you don't metabolize those nutrients well. And it's just like, and you only get there through the dialogue, but it's such an aha moment. And then you insert the fix, and it's like they're a whole new athlete. And it's hard for people who are not so in tune with their body to realize that you can actually, once you get call it the holistic picture of you, right, in the context of your goals with a guide, how you really can have that aha moment. And it's just so, it's authentic as a sneeze or a laugh. It's like, you don't even know where it came from. So take, for example, there's the entrepreneur I was working with, I referred to you, and, he's been traveling all over the world.
Right.
And it's just, that's the nature of the beast.
Sure.
And, but never in his life has he been able to do it with the kind of, energy as a result of the, diet changes, and of course the magic powder that
it's not magic, it's DNA based.
I know.
Well, there is a magic synergy, I will say, because of the unique combination of ingredients that, based on my literature review of genomics and how nutrients are influencing gene expression.
Right. Well, so this comes back to the beginning of the conversation when you asked me, like, does this make sense? DIM plus phosphatidylcholine. And yes, well, it makes sense because you have this hydrophobic molecule, and the absorption needs to be emulsified. Otherwise, it's insoluble.
That's right.
So but to really simplify it, it's like vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin. If you're on a fat-free diet and you're taking a vitamin D supplement, you might have an issue absorbing it. And so that's what we're talking about, is when there's a synergistic blend like this, it's like you might have been taking all of these nutrients, but not in the ratios and not in the context that is going to help for absorption. So it's no joke when you start to see the effects of synergy, because it literally feels illogical. It's like 1 + 1 = 3, right? So, like the people I've been talking to, who would give testimonial to what, you've been doing. And, I give my own testimonial as well. There are things like, I don't use caffeine anymore. Right.
Yeah.
Because, by the way, actually, I learned that I was a slow metabolizer of caffeine. And if I was ever going to use caffeine, as we identified, it's like, well, you can do it before a workout. And,
correct.
And then that's it. And, but even that, Joe, I found that it really brings a whole bunch of unnecessary angst to the moment. And, it's like, hey, just some B vitamins and acetylmethionine methionine and, macronutrients in ratios that don't burn me out. So that's, I'm much more suited to that, kind of zone paleo diet. And that's not everybody, right? But it's so easy to go, oh, I do carnivore, or I do, the keto diet. And it's like, I mean, there's just so much variation in our DNA. it's a trap, and you can become, you know, a little well, neurotic about your
Yes.
it's really easy to fall. But then, you know, you get the assurance that like, hey, no, I'm eating for my DNA. And so, yeah, so like I said, it's not just me that's saying things like, oh, well, I don't use as much caffeine. I'm sleeping better. I don't have problems falling asleep. I don't have problems waking up. I'm not groggy when I wake up.
Mhm.
You know, because of the conversation, it's like I've started to notice a natural, you know, circadian rhythm in the day, and I've learned how to leverage my energy up at different points. And so, again, it's not pointing to any one thing. Like Zen masters would say something to the effect of, well, there's nothing in particular that I can teach you. But really what they're saying is there's no one thing. It's
Right.
all of the things.
Right.
So okay, tell me about the longevity side of what you're working on, because that's a really exciting thing that I've learned you are starting to develop. I mean, just as recently as this year. So, you know, for folks listening, like all the goodness that we've just talked through, I mean, just by its nature
Yeah.
leads to an extended, so not just longevity, but an extended health span. So
Right. Right.
yeah. So for me, it's like I would like my body to always feel like when it did when I was like mid to late 20s racing. Is
Mhm.
that possible? I'm not trying to live to be 200 or anything like that. I would just like to always feel good in my body and sharpen my mind. So tell
Uh-huh.
us where you're going with the longevity stuff.
Well, that's a good question because I think more and more people are looking at their lifespan and they want to have a quality of life to in their seventh or sixth, seventh, and eighth decade of their life that
Right.
matches what they did when they were in their 20s and 30s.
Right.
Simply because we know a hell of a lot more today about the human body than we did 10 years ago, even 20 years ago,
Yeah.
as it relates to longevity
Mm-hmm.
and the absence of chronic illnesses,
Mm-hmm.
because that's key. If you look at the centenarians, the people that have lived to 100 plus, they don't have the diseases that we find in people in their 40s or 50s, like diabetes or metabolic syndrome. What they have is a unique genomic profile that
Mm-hmm.
allows them resilience after an event that might be stressful or might be cataclysmic, like COVID. There's a report that I read this week showing this interrelationship between the severity and the number of COVID infections and the aging process. So that's another variable that we now have to include if we're looking as far as longevity goes. You know, it's not so much looking at the traditional chronic illnesses. We're now having to look at infectious diseases. So because that is decreasing someone's lifespan or health span. And as a consequence, we're coming up with, I have a group of individuals that have taken my certification course in nutrigenomics, and we are coming up with a little product or package that allows people to get a handle. It's like a model. So the model that we have envisioned is basically using as a foundation Dan Buettner's Blue Zones.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not familiar with Dan Buettner and what he wrote, oh God, must be 10 years ago, he went around the world looking for centenarians, people who've lived to be 100 plus. And he's wanted to find behavioral, environmental, and nutritional issues that are associated with those individuals that have lived a long, productive life. And so he came up with 5 different elements, which I think become the foundation. We're adding more things to it because that was 10 years ago. We have much more data today on this longevity issue beyond the 5 things that Dan Buettner looked at. And so that becomes then a cornerstone. You can basically check the boxes as to how you're doing in each one of these categories. More like a matrix.
Mhm.
And then if you're scoring lower on a particular category, then that's an area that you may want to get a guide to help you understand what's going on. And then the next level is using biomarkers. And the final tier is looking at someone's genome. So we're looking at behavioral issues, dietary recommendations, and then looking at biomarkers as to how those habits people are doing are impacting their physiology, their biochemistry, their metabolic pathways. And then last but not least is to superimpose, if you will, someone's DNA so that we can modify gene expression using either lifestyle choices like abstaining from caffeine or using a nutrient, as in the case of diindole methane, DIM, to upregulate certain biochemical pathways so that you obviate that individual's risk for a particular chronic illness. As I said, longevity is just the absence of chronic illnesses.
There's a couple of things there that I think are really interesting. Let's see. So the first is, well, the notion when we talk about the blue zones is I'm not looking for the magic genome, or I'm not looking for the magic behavior. I'm not looking for the magic superfood. I'm not looking for, the magic single set of social circumstances, let's say.
Right.
Because we know things like, for example, you could just win the genetic lottery and smoke until forever,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
drink and live to be 110. Like we know there are those people. And when I say it's not even winning the genetic lottery, I think what I mean to say is winning the nature nurture lottery, right? Because that person that smoked and drank and lived till 110, let's say, might not fare so well in another environment,
Exactly.
and so like you don't want to trivialize what it is that we talk about the DNA part as the compass. So don't want to trivialize that as, okay, well, once you know your genome, that's it. It's like no, like now it's like you kind of have to reset. Well, every time that, again, some instance in your life changes, it's like now I gotta literally check down in my genetics,
Exactly.
my compass. So the interesting thing is that you talked about like gene expression. I want to spend a couple of minutes just giving your background on biochemistry and genomics. Is the role for nutrition basically as the trigger for the change in gene expression.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So can be seen as like food as the information to turn that gets information with your genome. And so the whole thing is information of this nature nurture expression.
Right.
And so what? Also then, how does that tie into, well, I mean, intergenerational longevity? So what I'm talking about now is epigenetics, right?
Right.
So you've got your DNA nucleotides, your code, you've got open access based on what your parents did before. That's something a lot of people don't know.
Yep.
And then there's what you're doing right now is not just good or bad for you, but it's good or bad for your children. So if you want true longevity of your genes, like thousands of generations into the future, so I've introduced a third variable now. So there's the DNA sequence, there's the activation of that DNA sequence, which is the nutrition. Then there's the legacy of that activation, which is the epigenetics, which can be changed in a lifetime. But riff on that for a bit. I think people might love that.
Yeah. So there was a lot of emphasis when the Human Genome Project was completed in 2001, 2002. There's a lot of difference as to whether the genome was entirely unfolded in 2001, 2002. Doesn't matter. Over the years, what we've seen is that there's another layer that complements someone's genome. So the way I reference this is I use an example. And the example is that if your body is put under a stressor of some kind, let's call it pollution from wildfires, because it's pretty prevalent. That has an effect on not your single nucleotides that are part of DNA, but another layer that sits on top of the DNA called your epigenome. And what do I mean? There are subtle changes that can occur not by replacing a nucleotide, but through a methyl group, through someone's biochemistry that has to be working functionally. And what I mean by that is that there are two gears that are part of a metabolic system that work together to generate these methyl groups. Methyl groups are a carbon plus 3 hydrogens. And these are signaling agents, if you will, to communicate to the DNA that there is a stressor going on in your life, and we need to do some things to improve your survivability. There are now tests that can unwrap the number of methyl groups on someone's genome. There are literally millions of methyl containing molecules connected to the DNA. Based on your experiences, remember I said in the Genesis matrix, environment plays a role?
Yep.
Yeah. So how is environment influencing someone's DNA at the epigenetic level through these methyl groups?
Yeah.
And there are now tests to be able to quantify the number of methyl groups on someone's genome. And there are I'm not going to say definitive studies. I'm going to say there are studies in the process of developing a biological clock based on someone's number of methyl groups on their genome. So so in that third tier that I was talking to you about longevity, it's not only looking at someone's genetics, which is basically what you inherit from mom and dad, your genome, which are subtle changes in your DNA over your lifetime, plus the epigenetic markers that have now attached to your genome because of things that you've encountered in your lifetime.
Right. Or your parents encountered in their lifetime.
That's right. Yeah. So those are inherited, but we also encounter more methyl groups based on someone's exposure to the smoke or pollutants of a wildfire.
Right. So we just went down a DNA.
Did we go down the rabbit hole?
Now, I want to bring it back for, it's called people are just hearing about genomics versus genetics for the first time today. So the way I think about, our genome, for example, is well, it's, even though you're presented with a digital code, which, we as humans read as, letter by letter, that's not how the genome manifests inside every single one of your cells. So in every single one of your cells, you've got 23 chromosome pairs. And that's where the billions of base pairs are distributed. And they're not just distributed in strings, right? They're all wrapped up.
That's right.
And you could imagine it. It might think it is so overwhelming as, tangled shoelaces or spaghetti, but it's there's some real intelligence there in how those DNA chromosomes are structured and compacted, because you're not expressing everything all at onse.
Correct.
Right.
That's
so
right.
It makes sense to only expose different regions of the genome based on the stress that you're trying, that is to your benefit to respond to. So now I'm thinking, like, I'm speaking multi-generationally, I'm speaking in terms of evolution, which you can't ignore. Like, so for example, a well-known, well-documented study is the Dutch hunger famine in terms of epidemics, right? So
it's an excellent example.
Expose wartime. So you're terrified for your life, and famine, no food. So doesn't it make sense that, children in utero during that time went on to experience an epigenetic change such that it modified their response to food and actually their preset behavior. Higher predisposition to being paranoid schizophrenia, which makes sense in a time of war, and more likely to become obese, which makes sense in a time of scarcity. So the bodies are amazing. And I know it's really hard to look at that if you're somebody that suffers with paranoid schizophrenia and obesity. It's like, wow, my body's amazing. But my point is, for giving, that extreme example, is that becomes part of the conversation when you start to, speak with these, guides, so to speak. So it's not just, well, what's your DNA sequence? It's what have you been doing in your lifetime? And
That's right.
Your parents even do it in the lifetime previously, because, that is all critical information to lead to the set of experiences, the set of experiences that have led you to the current circumstances. And then we can look at, well, what's the first domino that we're gonna move? But we know we're thinking holistically, and this only becomes deeper and deeper, the more it's conversational. So the more conversations I have with you, the more I understand myself. It's like every time I got on a call with Dr. Joe, it's like I probably added 10 years of my life. I've taken away this pain. I probably added 10 years of, health span to my life. What do you think about AI? Like, how does this become, because, not everybody can have their own Dr. Joe. Like, as we'll see, we're going to launch your product with sequencing.com, this year, hopefully before the new year. I mean, I think we can have that up and going very, very soon. And I know you have a team, so it's not just Dr. Joe, it's Dr. Joe plus the 100 or so experts you've trained. But even so, it's like, that's really only going to be, let's say, between 1,000 on the conservative end, maybe 10,000 people on, that we're going to be able to help in, say, like the next 1 to 3 years. So what's your vision for how much of this can be fully automated? That's not even the right word. How much of this can be
machine learning?
Yeah. So how do we bring the machine learning, the AI, and, do you envision a point where the human is removed completely and people are, they have their own, like I call it, like Iron Man's, Jarvis AI, right? Like, will we get to a day like that? And, any answer is going to be right or wrong at this point.
I know, because it's unfolding. AI is just unfolding in exponential terms. What, in a way, AI has, I've always had that in the back of my head, is how can we streamline this? Because as you said, not everyone can have an 2-hour conversation with me about their genome.
Right.
But I can share with you something that has really pinpointed how AI could play a role in someone's understanding of their genome without me being involved. So I'm going to give you an example. At least the DNA tests that I do, I can look at 7 different components of someone's vitamin D metabolism. So vitamin D is one of those nutrients that all of us need, not only for our bone health, but also for our immune system. So if I look at someone's DNA information, and just with that as a guide, I can predict, and I'm going to use quotes around that, I can predict what their circulating level of 25 hydroxy vitamin D is, which means that you either are replete, moderately replete, or you're deficient. If you're deficient, just based on 3 different enzymes that are being coded by certain genes. So if that information becomes readily available, then a clinician, all he has to do, or she, has to look at someone's DNA and said, we don't need to do a biomarker test. I already know it's going to be lower than 30 nanograms per mil based on that information, which then can lead to a nutrigenomic intervention based on somebody's DNA.
Right. Well, the interesting thing too with bloods is, I mean, unless you're on a schedule with bloods, and I know there are some solutions for that, but a lot of time people are getting it reactively. And so by the time they order the blood, get the blood test, they might have actually fixed the issue on their own. So it can be elusive, or an issue Yeah, so it could have, I don't want to say resolved on its own. They just got lucky and got some sun in the case of vitamin D, for example, right?
Or if they can't use the ultraviolet radiation
Mm-hmm.
from the sun,
Mm-hmm.
then they're going to be in again, those are the three genes that I'm looking at that are associated with enzymes that tell me you can get out in the sun for 24 hours and you're not going to convert enough of that
Right.
ultraviolet radiation to make cholecalciferol, which is your active form of vitamin D.
Go ahead.
And then if you look at what's going on within the cell at the vitamin D receptor level, you can then start saying, wow, even though you are getting adequate amounts of vitamin D, whether it's coming from milk or cheese or whatever source you're looking for, or a supplement, you have an issue here with your receptors not seeing the active form of vitamin D, which is 1,25 dihydroxy vitamin D,
Mm-hmm.
which means that you need a higher level of the precursor 25 hydroxy vitamin D than the average person.
Yeah. And, not trivial that you're on vitamin D. I mean, this is centered around the immune response, immunity, autoimmunity. Like this is, again, to make it personal, bringing it back to me, like my mom, MS. We know
Correct.
people. Yeah, we know the incidence of MS increases the further you move from the equator, suggesting
Exactly.
right, vitamin D role there. So, but the thing is that all of this, I want listeners to know that all this biochemical speak, although it may sound overwhelming, I think you'll be overwhelmingly delighted when you go through and hear about your own biochemistry. And by the way, it's like even if you just leave a consultation with just one change, that's enough to start moving you in the right direction. And so maybe just to kind of bookend our call, Dr. Joe, if we could just we've kind of talked through the whole process as kind of a mosaic, but let me just see if I've got it recapped here. So, step number one is there is a comprehensive health
Questionnaire.
comprehensive health questionnaire.
Right.
And then, well, actually, even before that, there's an initial call with you.
Yes, correct. Yeah. So because oftentimes people come to me either through a referral,
Right.
or that they have heard about what I'm doing and they've been to 25 different healthcare professionals and they're fed up with the traditional medical model.
Right.
And they want someone to work at the biochemical and cellular levels so that they can understand what's going on. People are hungry, as I've found, to understand what's going on biologically within their body. It's like when they see their DNA, it's like a light bulb goes off.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, this is who I am. Yeah, this is who you are today.
Yeah.
We can change gene expression. We can't change the gene itself, but we can change expression.
So that's a very important first point, is you're not just working with anybody. You're working with people who have already made a decision to change, to either, work on understanding themselves so they can get rid of this probably excruciating pain and inflammation in their lives, or they're at this, chasing greatness in terms of how do I extend my
lifespan.
So it's not, you don't just work with anybody. And so that's why the first call really like, hey, are you ready to do this? It's going to take commitment. It's going to be worth it.
Yep.
So you do that, it's like that whole adage, the what is it? The teacher emerges when the student appears kind of thing, right?
Correct.
So you're looking for that fit. Once you get that, then there's a comprehensive health questionnaire. And and that's a trip. So, I mean, that took me like what, a week or two to finish? I mean,
Yeah.
You can get it done in 4 or 5 days, I think, but
Yes.
but it's no joke, right? And the thing is, it's like, well, the more you invest on providing accurate information, the better your service is going to be, your better outcome is going to be.
Right.
So that's number 2. And then number 3 is then you send the DNA.
Right.
And then you analyze the DNA in the context of the matrix. Well, the DNA is part of that matrix, yeah.
Right.
Okay. And so then you do the consultation.
Right.
So we go through, and basically, I think you give people a PhD in their own bodies, which a PhD these days probably costs $250,000. So you're getting it at a steal, right?
Yeah.
And then, okay, so then there's that consultation, and that comes with a set of recommendations. But
Right.
as part of it, there's the DNA-based powder, in addition to behavioral changes that
Right. Right.
are in line with where you want to go. And then let's say number 7, there's the ongoing follow-up.
Yeah, which are essentially biomarker testing,
Right.
to make sure that
Yeah.
we've got the right amounts of a nutrigenomic intervention. And
Right.
if we need to tweak it, we can do so based on
Yeah.
that biomarker.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the journey, right? From
That's the journey.
this splinter in my side that it's basically got me to a point of being incapacitated, or I know I can be better. How do I get unlocked?
Mhm.
So the answer to all of those questions, and everything in between, is a commitment to understanding yourself, and then investing in a guide like Dr. Joe Veltman. And so, Dr. Joe, how do people find you? I'll put these stuff in the comments, but how do they find you?
They
Can't wait.
the easiest way to connect with me is either call me, and my telephone number is 505-231-7447. I'm based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. If you are passing through Santa Fe, I do see patients here in my home office. If they want to have a Zoom call, we do that as well. I also can be reached through my email. That's J.R. Veltman, VELTMANN @gmail.com.
Cool.
Those
Awesome.
those are the easiest way. I'll tell you now, texting is a low priority for me, but I will from time to time check my text messages. But those are the two avenues or portals that are best to try to connect with me. And
Awesome.
then, as I said, once you've made contact with me, I'll set up a time to walk you through the process and to give you some understanding that this is quite different from just throwing things on the wall and hoping they stick. This is really about you following your progress over time so that we develop a relationship, not just, a casual encounter.
Oh, I gotcha. Right. And, it is a very comprehensive dive into your genomics, covering areas like bone health, cardiovascular health, cognitive health. We've got detoxification, diabetes, eating behaviors, emotional health, exercise, hormonal health, immune health, micronutrients, migraine susceptibility, oxidation reduction, telomere length, thyroid health, weight management. And so all those things are considered, and the 100+ genes associated with those, into a sort of, well, what would you say, polygenic. It's not enough to say polygenic score. It's polygenic plus poly-environmental genesis matrix. And of course, this is always updating and improving because new literature is coming out. We're only getting better at making these insights more precise and more comprehensive. And then plus you've got a team of around 100 or so specialists in genomics that can help people start to decode and action their DNA. So Dr. Joe, I think I have to thank you for, again, taking the time to speak with me. You and I have been having conversation now for about 1.5 years. It's just been a pleasure. At every conversation, I get to know you more. So I hope, with this podcast, we can reach out and connect with those individuals struggling to make a change and inspired to know themselves. Because I got to say, you're worth knowing if you're listening.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank
Great.
you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jeremy. It's been a pleasure myself talking to you and sharing this concept. The Genesis Matrix model is, I think, a way to help people truly understand who they are from the inside out, not from the outside in.
Love it. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Be well.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on DNA of Things. We hope today's episode with Dr. Joe Veltman provided valuable insights into the power of genomics in transforming health and wellness. Now, from understanding the Genesis matrix to exploring personalized DNA-based interventions, we've covered how these advancements can enhance your quality of life and longevity. Remember, your DNA is not your destiny, but a compass guiding you toward optimal health. By leveraging the insights discussed today, leveraging your own genome, you can start to make informed decisions that have lasting impacts on your well-being. If you found this episode enlightening, please share it with others who might benefit. Let's spread the knowledge and empower more people to take care and take control of their health from the inside out. Stay tuned for more episodes. Until next time, take care of your DNA and it'll take care of you. That's the expression of your potential. Until next time.